being a PhD student drives you to drink a lot of coffee because you have to be up, focused on for long periods of time writing and long periods of time just thinking about your research and so on. So,
hello there. My name is Kit Rackley. My pronouns are they, them, and this is Coffee and Geography. The aim of the show is to get to know, explore, and celebrate the diverse and intersectional range of people on this rock we call home and their love and passions of it. We'll find out why guests identify as geographers, and if they don't exactly, we'll have fun exploring all the myriad of ways that connects their life to geography. So, pour your favourite brew, get cosy, and listen in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at CoffeeJogPod. Off we go. Hi everybody, welcome to Coffee and Geography, and I am joined by a wonderful guest. I'm going to say hi to Dr Keston Perry. Hello, welcome.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. And you've had such a busy day today, so I really do appreciate you sparing the time. You had a unexpected presentation to give or something like that, but how did it go?
It's a meeting that was planned in advance, but I had not anticipated that it would go for the length of time it went, and I had some information that I needed to give. So that's what took up my time today, and I have a talk to give this afternoon and so on. So yeah.
Well, I'm hoping this will be a nice little break for you, and then we'll leave you with enough time to get to your talk this afternoon. So to introduce you, Keston is a political economist and interdisciplinary scholar interested in Afro-Caribbean economic thought, global finance and climate justice. He is currently a lecturer in economics at the University of West England and previously was a postdoctoral scholar at Tufts University. And he has published work on industrial policy, climate finance, and decarbonization, financialization in resource-wealthy countries. Wow, that sounds pretty amazing. Is there any particular aspect of that which you kind of think, I like that bit a little bit more than that, or is it just all good to you?
So I think I suppose my interest over time has really evolved and changed. In part, my personality is I can't stick on one thing for a very long time, and so I have to sort of find ways to continue stimulating myself intellectually, but also it has to be something that also is my passion. So my interest in work with respect to it's all linked. It sounds as though it's a sort of disparate set of activity, but it's definitely all linked. So I've come to this from the perspective of understanding a country, a resource-based country in the Caribbean region, Trinidad and Tobago, and understanding how its history of development is impacted by, colonialism, external influences like, international organizations and so on. And sort of more recent stuff is linked to how poorer, underdeveloped countries such as Haiti has been within the current sort of context, how it has been affected by international institutions, how it's affected by sort of a changing climate, and how those forces impact on the country's ability to address those problems, right? And really as one of the countries that's most vulnerable to climate change. So that's where, my interests on finance and so on and connect with understanding mitigation, climate mitigation, and understanding impacts in countries in the global south.
Yeah, and a name that you might know this person because he works in a similar field to you, but there's someone who's been very active in the geography teacher community called Dr. Leon Seeley, who does a lot of this work and did a talk at the Geographical Association conference, which was absolutely amazing. And I'm also part of a decolonising geography group. And you're right, there's so much of these intersectional things that we talk about in that group. And the group is saturated with such brilliant discussion. But there's so many different facets and so many different ways that you can come across this. And I'm really, really keen to ensure that we can all communicate these kind of issues to young students, in high school. So I think it's very, very exceptionally important work that you do. We'll come back to that in a bit more detail because there's a couple of bits there which I really want to discuss with you. Although I don't want you to talk shop too much, but you talk about your passions how you so wish. So we're mapping our beverages to demonstrate just one example of interconnectivity around the world, but also as a resource to allow teachers to help students explore and critically apply claims to sustainability and ethical practices. So what do you usually like to drink, Keston? What brew do you usually have in front of you?
Well, actually, today I've been drinking coffee. I've been drinking a mocha. I don't know. I love chocolate and I love coffee. And so, well, it's interesting because I think my love for it has come about here in the UK, in part because being a PhD student drives you to drink a lot of coffee because you have to be up, focused for long periods of time writing and long periods of time, just thinking about your research and so on. So, yeah, that's how my feel for coffee has come about. I was not a coffee drinker 4 or 5 years ago, right? So it's cool.
Is there a particular brand you gravitate to, or do you just pick up anything off the shelf?
So I mean, in not to promote any brand, but I do like Costa Coffee. I it's really cool. So I drink both their canned coffee, but I also drink what they offer in this as a hot drink. And in terms of brand, these are things that really slip me. Apart from the Costa, there's one that I buy at the supermarket that my friend introduced me to, and I cannot remember for the life of me. I can't remember the brand right now. But yeah.
Yes, yeah, we're not here to promote brands. In fact, what we're doing, we want to name the brands and everything because when we map these onto our interactive map, we want the students to do some inquiry work and challenge their claims to sustainability and their ethical practices. So by mentioning Costa, yes, we know that there are other outlets available. By mentioning Costa, then the students will say, right, okay, that was mentioned on the podcast. Let's go and see if they really do stick to their sustainability and ethical claims and all that intersectional stuff, not just working practices, but how they use water and resources in the local area and things like that. So yeah, thank you for that. And students, Costa, how sustainable are they? Go and have a look.
I think if we're talking about coffee as well, we also have to think perhaps about how these brands are sometimes connected to sort of larger practices of exploitation sometimes in the global south. So where do they source their coffee? How do they source them? And also thinking about sort of wider impacts on inequality as opposed to I like to think about climate change, if we're linking this to climate change and sustainability, as opposed to individual choices. I like to think about them in terms of wider accumulating impacts of corporations, of governments, of those large scale entities that have a huge impact on our environment, but also have a huge impact on geographies beyond the immediate, beyond the shops or the coffee shop and that we see on our daily commute or whatever, they have very wide impacts because of globalization, because of longer histories of colonialism and extractive activities. So we definitely need to think about it, as you say, in a much more larger scale than we normally do.
Absolutely. And when geography teachers talk about this kind of stuff, one thing they get the students to understand is this whole chain, right from the primary producer all the way through to not just the consumer, but post-consumer as well. So like the waste and everything. And every single link in the chain has got its own issues. It's got its own challenges to sustainability. It's got its own links to colonialism, every single step of the way. And so there's the nuance is amazing. The intersection is amazing. And which is why I feel that the whole decolonizing process of the curriculum right now is so important, because it runs so deep that it needs to be untangled, because we go through our consumerist capitalist life without thinking about these things and how they have real tangible impacts on people around the world. So
Yeah, definitely.
I love that link you made.
No, you're right. There are certainly, as his geographies and if we think about geographies and how colonialism has impacted spaces and peoples and communities beyond our immediate environment, we have to think in terms of a historical sense, but we also have to think in a contemporary sense. How are those things newly being reformulated? How they're being manifested in new ways, sometimes disguised as well as, ethical, right, practices. They're sometimes disguised as fair trading and all these kinds of things, but often continuing a very long pattern of exploitation, continuing a longer pattern of extraction to some degree, and those things impact on the life chances of people outside of our immediate environment, and impact on communities that we sometimes can't see. We see them in various forms through the media, and they're depicted often as hapless beings and without agency in some ways, but often we don't make the connection, as I was talking today actually in the earlier meeting, how do entities like the Queen of England, entities like European states and governments, how did they become wealthy, right? It has, it is all linked to the transnational activity, all linked to how corporations receive support from these governments and states, and that kind of colonial process that happened and is happening. It hasn't, in my view, ended, and there isn't a truncation to say it's ended and now it's a new period. It's often lingering effects that we feel even today.
Yeah, and one of the things that was fascinating when I was teaching about globalization and fair trade and free trade, I didn't realize to the extent that where fair trade, theoretically is a really good system, paying the primary producers more, stuff like that. The more I dug into it, I realized that actually ones which are managed poorly undercut local markets. They undercut the people who work in the local area to the point where they could be priced out of things. And so there's a local economy is completely geared up to benefit the Western societies and the consumers in the Western societies. So as geographers, we've got a responsibility to help the children to critically appraise things like the fair trade program and whatnot, and to say, to what extent is it a good alternative, or should it be better, and how can it be better? So I think and you're right, it's a very, very slow burner, isn't it? It's not happening overnight, and we've got so much historical context to unpick and untangle that, and which is why the work that you do in particular is exceptionally important. I'm very, very happy to share it with people listening. So we'll go back to, in fact, where you are in London is one of the epicenters of this process, isn't it? Of the globalization and, colonial because you're near the London Docklands in Plaistow, aren't you? So, because that's roughly where my dad comes from. He's from the East End of London himself, and my granddad used to work in the docks a few times. And of course, you've got all the redevelopment that's taken place, which has not necessarily benefited the local people to the best. So what I would like to ask you, Keston, is you said you're from the Trinidad and Tobago. So how much of that identity is still with you? And how much has the east of London kind of like crept into your identity, maybe shaped your identity a bit? I mean, you already mentioned in a kind of fun way that it's kind of made you drink coffee because of your friends and stuff. So how much of your identity from the Lesser Antilles is still with you, and how much of it has been shaped by being in London?
It's interesting. So I think so my I guess my coming to East London has happened through being in various locations in London as well, right? As a student, I was living at the beginning in Bow when I first moved here, and to London, that is. And I moved to Forest Gate, and then I moved to where I am now, in near to Canning Town. So I suppose my experience as an immigrant, or someone seeking opportunities, but also trying to understand how my own experiences as a person, a black person, person of you know experiencing London from, I suppose, before Brexit happened, and then post Brexit. I It has been a very, I should say, somewhat a difficult experience, because it has meant my identities as an immigrant has also come to the fore, right? Actually, after I finished my PhD, uh, trying to get a job in the UK was impeded by those kinds of Brexit activities, and the fact that jobs were actually being advertised only to nationals, to British nationals, or to European nationals. And I moved here actually as a result of not being able to find a job in the first instance. And my friends, living with friends at a
Right,
point in
yeah.
time, up until recently, actually, in near to Canning Town, in part because I couldn't find that job, and sort of making the way through those challenges have influenced how, to some degree, I interact or engage, but I also disengage. I'm disengaged to some degree. I understand to one extent that Newham, for instance, is the poorest borough in London, and one of the most impoverished across the UK. And what that has meant is there's a history of immigration to East London. When friends have told me what East London, because my friend's aunt, for instance, has lived here since the 1980s, and the kind of development that happened after the Olympics, where train lines were extended and so on. There were, these places were cut off from certain parts of the UK, or parts of London, and those kinds of developments and the kinds of what we're seeing now in terms of gentrification, where we have very expensive apartment buildings and flats and so on being built, and that has meant resources, putting an underinvestment in the community, and an underinvestment or divestment from community activities, and community cohesion, to sort of real estate and property investment and property relations, and in one sense you can see you can see it physically, where you have these very expensive high end buildings and apartments and flats existing alongside houses that have been here for a long time, that are and communities that have very been very much underinvested. In part, that has to do with race, and that has to do with geography, and it has to do with colonialism. Like communities here, it's a very there are large portions of South Asian communities in East London that has manifested into the kinds of food you can see and experience in East London, but also the kinds of problems you see. At one point, Newham had very high rates of COVID, right? And that is obviously interacts with impoverishment and underinvestment, and because health services on the one end have been, and resources have been taken out of the community, where and property developers have come in and try to make their own enclaves. So we have now some gated areas in East London, as a result of those kinds of dynamics, which are really complex, but all intersect in very, very interesting ways.
Yeah, this is something we could talk about for ages. I mean, you mentioned you mentioned you first moved to Bow. That's my dad was born within the Bells of St Mary le Bow, so from Mile End and that area in Stepney. My first, I used to go into London quite a lot, but in terms of education, my first experience of that part of the world was going to Brick Lane. You mentioned all of, that area as a sixth form student. I loved it, and I loved going around and walking around and seeing all the cultural diversity there, and I just had that sense even at a young age about how enriching that was all. And you were mentioning about the difficulties that you've been facing, which is it's self-defeating for a country like United Kingdom, because the things that people like yourself and other immigrants have brought to this country in terms of their expertise, their cultural diversity, just the colour and the life it brings to this country, is one of the best things that was about this country, in my opinion. And to feel that we're going backwards, all that is a really big shame and quite upsetting, in my opinion.
Part of my experience also, it dovetails into my work, right? The reason I'm interested in things around how climate change impacts lower income communities in the global south, how colonialism is interrelated with those kinds of impacts. I think my experience really is reflected in part in what I'm interested in, and sort of questions that I ask in my research, and also the kinds of observations I make about communities like in East London, because I think it was Stuart Hall who said that we are here because you were there. And
Yep.
so the history of colonialism is not one that has ended, but it has created all forms of different kinds of migration patterns and changes, and ways of knowing and being. So what has happened, in my view, is, and I don't know if this was something before I came here physically, but as people, we've become very enclosed in ourselves, and London has that kind of feel. I remember I was living in the north before, so in Newcastle. And then the first time I took a train down to London, this was in 2012, I realized it was a different pace of life. And there was a different way that people navigated the environment and navigated London, in a very kind of impersonal way. And how what I experienced in Newcastle was just a very different kind of community vibe and spirit. It was very different. So it I suppose my story ties into how these geographies become heterogeneous, if we want to use that word, and how these geographies are not isolated, but are materially connected to each other, because we can't understand what we are today, how these kinds of phenomena, that we call modern, like new flats and new properties and new forms of gentrification. All those things happen because of certain sort of historical patterns. So yeah.
And I really have been annoyed by this whole thing from the top down about, we shouldn't be teaching our students about things like white privilege because you're going to make them feel guilt tripped and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, it's not about that. It's about teaching our true history and our true past, and what impact that has had throughout history back then, but how it's played and manifested into the history of today. I was living in San Francisco for a little bit and saw the kind of things that you've been talking about with the communities there. So when I was working out there, I worked at a place called the Exploratorium, which was a wonderful science museum, but they do a lot of community work as well. And for one of their talks, they had a group in called Shore Up Marin. And Marin is a district in the San Francisco Bay Area. And what's happening is that every time there's a king tide, obviously the water around the bay rises and it floods the Marin area out. And as you would guess, you would be able to guess this from your work, guess who lives in those areas? The poor people, communities of colour, people have been more or less marshalled into those areas because they are the cheapest places that they can afford, and there's been no investment for the people, not just gentrification. And the authorities won't touch it because they know it's a flood risk area and it will cost too much money to deal with all that kind of stuff. So, of course, those people are left in that social and environmental poverty. And talking to the people, but they are so passionate, they are very galvanized, but they cannot do it without allyship. They need the people with the money, with the privileges, with the means to support them, to be able to live safely in a place that they've been effectively forced to live in because of social circumstances.
So, I mean, yeah, there are those, those things, poverty and wealth exist alongside each other, right? So, and I always think about these things as relational. We can't have wealth without poverty on the one hand, and on the next. So, it has to, when we think about these things, it has to, and this is what I try to bring in to my own work on climate justice, the patterns of historical dispossession and which communities are affected by climate change the most or disproportionately are the ones that have been historically affected to a very great extent by colonialism. So one of the countries I'm particularly interested in is Haiti. As a society, it is at the one time it was for France the most lucrative colony that France had owned. If you look at in terms of the size of the country, it is not that large, and now today it only has about 10 million people, inhabitants, and at that time, France and was gaining its wealth because of, during the colonial times, that is, was gaining its wealth because of the plantations it had in Haiti. How I make that connection to current climate changes is the fact that the kinds of patterns of extractive agriculture, the kinds of environmental practices that were put into place during colonialism meant that communities, in order to get things like income and sources of energy, meant that communities in Haiti had to engage in certain kinds of deforestation, engage in environmental practices that were colonial practices at the very beginning. And over time, we know that climate change is a phenomenon that historically is hundreds of years in the making, right? So we have to link how that colonialism happened to why these countries are very exposed and experience the kinds of devastation they experience now after one environmental event or one catastrophe. And it's because their topography, their land has been either the kinds of environmental practices that indigenous communities were used to and were accustomed to revitalizing the land have gone, and that the colonial process truncated and really transformed the land and transformed how communities were able to engage with land and their relationship to land and to the environment. That process completely transformed that kind of relationship and makes now those communities after Britain, France, and colonial empires, how colonial empires historically have you know contributed the most to climate change. These societies, especially their wealthy elites, contribute the most, greenhouse gases to the environment. And now we see through frequency of storms, we see through frequency of hurricanes and landslides and the kinds of rainfall that we see, and droughts. So those kinds of consequences of climate change are happening more, and the effects are being felt in those communities to and those countries to a larger extent than in Britain and in Europe, right? And so it's interesting that history has come full circle.
Yeah.
The colonial and enslavement that happened in those countries is now kind of being felt through the new forms of dispossession and new forms of devastation those communities are feeling through climate change. So yeah, that's how I think I try to understand those kinds of phenomenon.
Uh, there's one popular book. It was a bestseller. Was by Tim Marshall about prisoners of geography. But there's been a lot of pushback on that book, and I think warranted criticism about environmental determinism, about how that has judged the course of development of certain nations around the world. But you have just painted a perfect picture of actually why are some of these countries prisoners of geography is because they were effectively, in many cases, they were placed in this prison by these colonial processes. As you said, Haiti was a very resource-rich place, not just what they had in the land, but how they were managing the land. And there's been lots of studies that have come out recently. Surprise, surprise, indigenous populations are the best at maintaining the environment. What a surprise, because of their, as you just said, because of their practices that they've been doing for thousands of years. And of course, colonialism's come and disrupted those, changed the environment, and then a lot of people have just taken the story from there. Oh, you're a prisoner of your geography. But so I think this is a really, really important thing that we need to investigate.
It's definitely something that has happened through a social process. It hasn't happened because the environment is doing wicked things to us, right? Or these things have storms and changes in temperature patterns and rainfall and precipitation are happening because out of nowhere.
Seriously.
Those things are happening because of I like to think of it in because of a social process and socially produced process of extraction, colonialism, and so on, as opposed to one that is environmentally determined,
Yes.
and only determined because your environment is fixed or your geography is fixed. It's definitely not, in my view, it cannot be thought about in that way. It has to be thought through a sort of relational and social dimension of these consequences, because these things are linked. Consequences and causes are linked through a complex kind of interaction. So you are correct that we can't see geographies as being fixed on the one hand, and cannot see that the environmental changes that have happened exist as a natural thing. It exists through kinds of social interventions that are made over time.
Yeah. And I know there'll be plenty of fans of Tim Minshaw and those that are like listening to this, but I just want everybody to think about this, right? Human populations before the age of industrialization, through natural migration, everything, they seek out environments which they can thrive in, be sustainable in, and then their culture will develop in. So if you go back in the earliest of human history, humans would move around anyway to be in an environment which suits them. So if that's the case, what was the disruptive influence which has caused a group of people, a society, a culture to now be prisoners of their geography, to now be at detriment to the environment? There's got to be something that came along to have disrupted that process. And as we've been discussing, it's mostly been people who have come from outside that environment, come into, disrupted their environment, causes all this disruption. And now, of course, as we say, we've got climate change, which is now, you said, bring it in full circle. History's coming full circle. And now changing the environment again because of the actions of those who've had the power to change the atmosphere to the extent that they have.
Yeah, and not to forget, they also, when they came, they brought, or they imported slave labor, enslaved peoples and Africans, and later on indentured people from Asia and so on, to to create the kinds of wealth that they wanted, right? The labor aspect of it is very, very critical to understand how that whole process began and continued, and what we're living through right now, the effects of those kinds of those changes and processes.
Yeah. So, as I said, this is a topic which is so deep, so intersectional. We could go on about it, and I'm hoping that colleagues of mine in the Decolonizing Geography group are listening to this, because this is so fantastic. And we're gonna get you to give a shout out and all your plugs in a minute, because if you're happy for people to contact you and kind of help out with this, it would be absolutely fantastic. Because your website, for example, is a great resource, and you've put lots of links in there to the stuff that you've been doing. I mean, I read earlier about the one that you wrote, Between the Devil, the Debt, and the Deep Blue Sea, why the South needs reparations for the climate crisis, and you've put a lot into that about the reasons for that is. And okay, I hopefully this doesn't come across as too reductionist or too crass, but I'm just thinking, I don't know if you can see behind me, Keston, but my living room floor is in absolute state because I've got a 7 and a 4-year-old, right? So what do? We teach them. We say you've got to clean up after your mess, be good to people, treat people how you want to be treated, and all that kind of stuff. Nobody will have an argument against those kind of values, right? So at a national level, we need to do this: clean up after your mess, take responsibility for the actions that you have been taking in other people's lives and other people's space, treat others how you want to be treated, And so these are human values we all have, and we teach to our children, even though there's Lego all over the floor at the moment. So, so yeah, it's frustrating. It's such a slow burner.
Yeah. No, you are correct. So this is something that is being discussed um, by leaders in the and advocates in the sort of reparations movement, right? So led by people like Sir Hilary Beckles
Beckles, yeah.
and the CARICOM Reparations Commission group, who have basically detailed what has happened through British colonialism in the Caribbean region and what has happened through that development process was basically truncated by what they call native genocide, so the decimation of indigenous populations and people, and by colonialism, right, and the African transatlantic and enslavement. And what they're saying is that, um, the reparations movement is saying that, Britain and European powers created the mess that many of the Caribbean region and many Caribbean countries are in, and left those countries without payment for the kinds of mess that they created. Instead, what they did is compensated slaveholders and enslavers like Edward Colton, whose statue was pulled down in Bristol. Many people don't make those kinds of connections,
Yeah.
or don't, or what Britain has happened is created a mythology around how Britain became a great power, or how Britain um, uh, achieved the kinds of wealth that it did, and has created a mythology that it was the British that abolished slavery because they thought it was was an evil system, but it was not. It was not the case, because Britain. It's interesting to know as well that Britain continued paying enslavers and slaveholders up to 2015.
Yes, they did.
2015,
Yeah.
the Treasury, back when emancipation was proclaimed in the Caribbean and in the West Indies in 1834, a decision was made by the British state to pay compensation for loss of property, and property being um, uh, both in terms of land and estates and plantation, but also humans, black black people, and enslaved people, right? So the loss of that property was, you know, given through compensation to um, to slaveholders. So and we also had the recent story as late as December 2020. We learned that the MP, the member of parliament for Somerset South, his name escapes me right now, but he failed to declare as one of his assets a slave house estate in the Barbados. So these people are still actually accumulating wealth as a result of that process. One thing I want to point out, it's not something that people should be um, it's understanding the contemporary manifestations of those things, right? It's understanding the effects of those things and are actually still going on. And what we need to do is not be necessarily, it shouldn't only cause us things like shame and embarrassment. It should cause us to think critically about patterns that we see today. And it should cause us to think what is due and what is just due to those communities that have been affected by those processes over a very long period of time. And how I link this to climate change is the fact that the colonial and colonial process has created the kinds of environments, very vulnerable and marginalized environments that those Black communities in the Caribbean now live in, and are faced and have whenever there's a storm, a tropical storm. We're currently in the Atlantic hurricane season. The types of storms and the types of the frequency of those storms have become much more it has become much more frequent but much more ferocious, the occurrence of those storms, and it is linked to how we have treated people and how we have treated those environments for profit, for personal and sort of wider benefits to British state and so on. So yeah, we have to kind of definitely, as you say, clean up the mess that we've created, and the mess that people who we think are so far gone and the histories are so far spent are not connected to our present environment. That's not the case, and we definitely need to think about that.
Keston, we're coming to the end of our time now. I know you're busy and you've been so gracious with your time. So let's link you to some previous guests now. So we have this last thing we like to do on the podcast about, which we call We Are All Geographers, and we try and challenge each other to link a word or a topic to geography. Now, last week, I spoke to the punk biologist Lucy Eckersley, and she had to come up with a link to language that was set to her by the guest beforehand. Now, when I asked Lucy what word she wanted to set you, she came up with the word art. Now, she wasn't specific about what type of art, although she loves photography and, painting and stuff like that. So you can approach this as loosely as you like, right? So in what way can you link things about the world, geography, to art? And usually I time people on this for 30 seconds. So are you up for the challenge?
Okay, that's a challenge. But okay. I think the way I would link it is communities have found ways to create art and find ways of manifesting justice through art. So during the 1950s, 60s, and in the UK in the 80s, Black Power movement was a way, and what they do.
But you can keep going.
What they did was create murals, and they created art, and they created art forms through music and so on, and theater to depict how communities have resisted various forms of oppression. So I think that's how I link it to art. At least my interest in that sense.
Well, that's the beauty about geography, is that I could give that same word to different people and they'd come up with different answers. But yeah, I used to use art in the broadest sense in my geography lessons all the time, whether it was painting, drawing, poetry, creative writing. I used to teach drama as well, so I brought drama into geography lessons quite a lot. And you mentioned Haiti. One of the things I used to do was do something called Teacher in Role, where we took this tragic but really, really poignant story about a rescue worker called Hector Mendez from Mexico who went to Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. And so I was Hector, and the kids had to ask me questions based on this true story. And yeah, I had and it was all about trying to bring empathy into things like earthquakes and volcanoes, because kids mostly, they love the explosions and stuff like that, but they lose the humanity, they lose the empathy. So it was a way of bringing it back. And no shame in saying I had the kids in tears, because it wasn't a pleasant story. It was a tragic story, but it needed to be told. So I thought I'd bring that, because that brings everything together for you. Right. But you now can come up with a word of your choice for our next guest. So for our next guest, what would you like them to try and link to geography?
I think justice is the word that I
love it.
I like, and and would try to get them to link
They're going to nail
geography.
The person that I'm going to speak to next is a wonderful geography teacher who speaks to loads of people as well. She does it more than I do. And I think she's going to nail that one. I think it'll be very interesting to hear what she comes up with. So to finish off, do you have anyone to shout out to, or a group of people, anybody?
I think the person that comes to mind is who's doing really great work in geography and contributing to Black geographies. There are two people, actually. One is Jovan Scott Lewis, who's a professor in the United States at UC Berkeley. And another person is Patricia Noxola, who is a geographer at University of Birmingham, who is doing amazing work around the Caribbean, around culture and so on. So that's who I think about.
That's a fantastic shout out. Pat's in our Decolonising Geography group. So that's absolutely amazing. Yeah, she's a wonderful, wonderful person, and full respect for people like Pat and what she does for the community. And she gave a talk at the Geographical Association conference as well, just gone. Keston, how can people link up with you if they're interested in linking up to expand our geography community? So you've got Twitter, you've got a website, so you can give those a plug for us?
Sure. My website is kestonperry.com. It needs updating a lot. And my Twitter my handle is @radical_Carib. So that's linking to the Caribbean region, radical_Carib. Yep.
Brilliant. Keston, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for squeezing in some time, because I know you've had such a busy day.
Thank you so much for listening.
I tell you what, this is so worth it.
If you haven't already done so, please subscribe so more stories and experiences can drop into your favourite podcast app. If you fancy being a guest or have any feedback, follow us on Twitter @CoffeeGeogPod and send us a DM. Or you could email coffeeandgeog@geogramblings.com. Until next time, keep geogging.